I'm Penelope Hunter-Stiebel. I've worked with many museums in different countries, but I've never known one like this. For me, it was love at first sight. But I completely misunderstood the character of the object of my affection. I thought it had to be a restored mission, hundreds of years old. I found out it was a purpose-built art gallery and built between April of 1916 and November of 1917. And that this building defined the Santa Fe that we see today. Just months after New Mexico was finally granted statehood in 1912, the Santa Fe City Planning Commission decided that they had to rescue the city from being absorbed into Middle America. Well, that had been happening since the coming of the railroads in the 1880s. Now, this building was the model for the development of the city in a way that would create a tourist industry, much needed. You see, it was done for you and me, the visitors who'd come to this special place. Some return again and again, and some of us stay. While I tell you more about the building, do have a seat and take in the tradition-steeped atmosphere here. The hand-fashioned woodwork and the ceilings, you'll see them throughout. When they built this place, they were building an idea that it would be possible to adapt traditional Hispanic and Pueblo Indian architecture to modern requirements in a way that could be adopted and make Santa Fe, the city, different. The overall inspiration for the building was the oldest surviving mission church, built in 1629 at Acoma, Pueblo. It still stands there today, but this museum incorporates ideas from other historic buildings too. Now, all the missions were made of adobe, and this museum is not. The Spaniards introduced the shaping of adobe, mud, into sun-dried bricks. Then the bricks were plastered over with mud. Now, this building is not that dissimilar in technique, but the bricks were kiln-fired and made by inmates in the state penitentiary. I found in the archives that the penitentiary supplied 750,000 bricks. Now, this was supplemented by 48,000 pounds of steel girders brought from Chicago and 2,800 barrels of cement from the Ideal Cement Company in Colorado. Now, that cement served two purposes. There were structural, concrete elements, but they also diluted the cement and mixed it with sand and plaster to apply to the bricks to create the soft shapes that look like adobe. Now, all those sculptural contours that you see in the building today are the original plasterwork. Only the stucco color coating has had to be redone, and that only 3 times since 1917. If you'd like to learn about the people involved and how they accomplished this before we go exploring, push number 502. But if you'd like to go on directly to the St. Francis Auditorium, push 503. The architects of record were Isaac Rapp and his firm, but the real creators were the archaeologists, artists, and civic leaders who took up the crusade to stop the loss of Santa Fe's character. You see, adobe dwellings were being rapidly replaced by big brick commercial buildings with plate glass windows and brick bungalow-style cottages. The leader in the movement was the archaeologist Edgar Lee Hewitt. He was a cultural entrepreneur. He founded and led multiple institutions. He saved the Palace of the Governors and turned it into the Museum of New Mexico before he added on the Art Museum. He was backed by the Honorable Frank Springer, an attorney, very wealthy and very politically influential. Hewitt hired on his protégés, who worked collectively, a kind of team of pals, and they all used their nicknames. There was Sylvanus Griswold Morley, known as Van. He was the Harvard man who spent half the year in Santa Fe promoting the city different, and the other half year in Mexico, becoming the preeminent archaeologist of Mayan Yucatan. Then there was Kenneth Chapman. Diligent administrator and trained as an illustrator, he became an expert on Pueblo Indian art. Carlos Vieira, very colorful painter, quite a character, who came to Santa Fe to cure his lung ailments, as so many more were to do. Vieira was the first resident artist of what was to become a thriving art colony. Jesse Nussbaum. Nuss, tall, lanky archaeologist, photographer, and motorcyclist. He had a hands-on background because his father was a contractor who owned a brickyard. It was Nuss who restored the Palace of the Governors. Things happen fast around here. In the fall of 1912, they staged the new Old Santa Fe exhibition with images and models of what Santa Fe architecture could, and they hoped would, be. Now, Van Morley had seen a photo of a Colorado mining camp with a warehouse facade based on the Acoma mission. So he found the architect, Rapp, and he asked him to make a watercolor to use in the display. Now, around this time, Hewitt was invited to be director of exhibits at the Panama, California exposition that was going to open in San Diego in 1915. So he went to Rapp and he asked him to develop that Acoma-inspired warehouse into a pavilion for the state of New Mexico. Well, the New Mexico building in San Diego was such a huge popular success that it convinced the legislature to okay the model for a new art museum. The construction budget was $60,000. Seems like nothing today. Half of that came from the legislature and half of that from private sources. That's where the Honorable Frank Springer went to work raising the funds. Jesse Nussbaum was appointed superintendent of construction, and it was Nuss who fleshed out the outlines that Rapp provided. Let's move to the St. Francis Auditorium, and when you're there, push 503. The St. Francis Auditorium was created as a much-needed secular civic center. So why did they make it follow the form of a church? Well, the idea was to connect with the social roots of this region. Churches were the only big public buildings traditionally, and that's where people gathered. Well, it certainly worked. For the opening ceremonies in November of 1917, 1,200 people squeezed into this space. Good thing there were no fire marshals there. Now look up at the ceiling. It's the model of a traditional New Mexican roofing system. They're those huge beams that support the roof, the vigas they're called around here, and then the small poles arranged in a kind of herringbone pattern. Those are called latillas. Now, Hewitt, the director, and the architect Rapp were dead against all this woodwork because they were intent on fireproofing the place. But Jesse Nussbaum supported that woodwork, he fought for it, and he prevailed. You see, he was fresh from working on the ruined Pecos mission, and he modeled the vigas here, and the shaped corbels at each end, and the chip-carved ornament on the fragments that he found out at Pecos. He wanted to avoid the splitting of the huge beams that he'd seen in the architecture of the region. So he found a supplier in California who towed lumber down the coast from Washington and Oregon. Now, in the process, salt water seeped into the logs, replacing and pushing out the sap. Nuss had the vigas cut in California, then covered with tarps for slow drying as they were shipped by railroad to New Mexico. The herringbone saplings, the latillas, were gathered in the mountains around Santa Fe. They'd been scouted by Nuss on his motorcycle. He found a stand of aspen saplings that had withstood a forest fire. Still standing, the fire had burnt off the leaves and sealed up the sap inside. The great acoustics in this auditorium are in large part due to Nussbaum's woodwork, but also to the irregular surfaces of the stucco-covered walls. Musical performances have always been important here, and today we have Santa Fe's prestigious Chamber Music Festival. If you'd like me to tell you about the murals, push number 504. I hadn't realized that this town's full name was the Villa Real de Santa Fe de San Francisco, and that the monks of the order founded by St. Francis came with the Spanish conquistadors to the southwest 80 years before the Pilgrims landed. This is the story the murals tell. The young artist, Donald Beauregard, composed the series while he was studying in Europe. He used symbolic figures, slender and pale, very much in the style of the French master Puvis de Chavannes. Beauregard did a full set of preparatory sketches, but tragically he succumbed to cancer at the age of 29. He'd only finished the central panel of the three-part composition on the left, which depicts Santa Clara. Now, members of the museum staff were called upon to complete the work. Kenneth Chapman had to do the panels of St. Francis on the left wall and up on the stage. Go over and take a close look at the single panel on the extreme left, where you see the saint kneeling by an archway. Chapman, Chap, The illustrator was used to working in drawing, working in watercolor, but he'd never before been asked to do oil on canvas, and certainly not in this scale. You can feel how tentative he was, painstakingly following Beauregard's design and carefully filling in the drawn lines, a bit like a coloring book. Well, what a contrast on the opposite wall. Carlos Vieira took on the subjects of the Franciscans in the New World. Vieira was an accomplished artist who'd already done paintings of missions and murals of Mayan ruins. The central three-part panel, where a Franciscan intermediary stands between the Spanish and the Indians, there he just transformed the indigenous figures that Beauregard has sketched as kind of primitive and submissive. With strong colors and sure brushwork, Vieira depicted a proud, fierce people, as noble as their Spanish counterparts. Now you might wonder why the single panel to the right of the stage shows Christopher Columbus. Well, Columbus went with his son to a Franciscan monastery for help, and it was a Franciscan monk close to Queen Isabella that got her to fund his expedition. Vieira had done a spell as a sailor himself. Clearly, he identified with the explorer, to the point that he turned the figure of Columbus into a portrait of Carlos Vieira. After you've checked out the murals, join me in the courtyard and push 505. The courtyard is constructed along the lines of a European cloister, but it's very New Mexican, with the porches on all four sides, portales we call them around here, that have thick tree trunk columns, topped by shaped wing-like corbels. Well, those are adopted from the oldest New Mexican houses. The garden here is tended lovingly by volunteers of the Santa Fe Garden Club. Take a moment to look around and up. The sculpted shapes of the architecture, the color against the sky, the soft forms with dark wood punctuation. Robert Henry, the painter, was the biggest name in American art at the time, and Edgar Lee Hewitt had convinced him to come to Santa Fe, where he spent his summers painting. Henry wrote about this building, "The museum here looks as though it were a precious child of the Santa Fe sky and the Santa Fe mountains. It has its parents' complexion. It seems warmly at home, as if it has always been there." This accomplishment had to be Hewitt's pride. The dictatorial director never retired. He hasn't left. His ashes are behind a simple plaque to the left as you entered. If you'd like to know more about the murals here, push 506. The series of murals opposite the courtyard entrance are so different from those oil-on-canvas murals in the auditorium. They're by Will Schuster, done in 1934. This was one of the earliest of the federal government commissions giving work to artists during the Depression. The subject, Pueblo Indian lifeways, was near and dear to the heart of archaeologist and anthropologist and still museum director Edgar Lee Hewitt. Schuster, known as Schuss, was the life of the bohemian artist colony of Santa Fe. It was a real pain for the free-spirited artist to have Hewitt at his shoulder, constantly giving instructions, but it was an even greater challenge to do the technique that was wanted. The technique was fresco, something perfected for wall painting in the Italian Renaissance. Well, Schuss, of course, had never done fresco, but he did a lot of research, and he studied the murals of the contemporary Mexican master, Diego Rivera. Do go over to the far door and look at the smaller mural of the Potters on the right, while I explain the technique. You see, you had to paint on wet plaster so that the pigments, the colors, would soak in. You could only do a little bit at a time before the plaster dried, and that little bit, as much as you could do in a day, was called a giornata. Look at the Potter kneeling on the left. If you follow the raised surface from the left edge up across her shoulders, down around her pot, and back to the lower left border, well, you've just got a giornata. That's the outline of it. Now, before you started with your wet plaster, you had to do a full-size drawing on paper. You then pricked holes along the lines of your drawing. You stuck the paper up onto the wall, and then you blew ash through the holes. You took down the paper, and you quickly connected the dots and painted in before the plaster dried. But look at the face of that Potter. Look at her nose. Her dots don't connect. There was only so far that Schuss would obey anybody's rules. Now don't miss the fresco by the hill on your right. It's between the restrooms. There's a wonderful audio stop there where you can hear the artist himself explaining the meaning of the work. Then I'll meet you inside the galleries for stop number 507. The galleries, as they were originally constructed, were way ahead of their time. They're brutalist in their modernism. Look down, that's the original cement floor. The walls were originally just white-painted cement. Lighting. Oh, they spent so much time discussing and planning and designing it. They divided the galleries into bays, and above each bay there was a skylight. Those have since been covered over so that modern track could be installed, making it possible for us to have nighttime hours. The ultimate goal of this place was economic development through tourism. Hewitt wanted to attract painters to Santa Fe so that they would be PR agents. In Hewitt's words, quote, revealing to the world the beauty of the Southwest, unquote. He gave them free rent studios in the Palace of the Governors, and he adopted an open-door policy in the museum. It was advocated by his art guru, Robert Henry. He allowed any resident or visiting artist to exhibit. No membership was required. There were no juries, no curatorial selection. But at that time, you have to realize there were no commercial galleries in Santa Fe. The museum sold works on the artist's behalf. The museum primed the pump of the Santa Fe art colony, and it laid the foundations of what would become today the third largest art market in the United States. After you've visited the downstairs galleries, do come upstairs. I'll be waiting for you in the corner gallery, the women's boardroom, for stop number 508. Now, this room was not originally a gallery at all. It was the women's boardroom, which was a sort of clubhouse. The ladies were given such important space because of their role. Hewitt hand-picked ladies for his women's board because they were to be his lobbyists. They influenced their husbands in favor of his projects, and they gave regular teas for politicians when the state legislature was in session. The color scheme here got Jesse Nussbaum in a ton of hot water. You can see it in the chip carving of the vigas above you. See the orange and the subtle shades of blue? Well, Hewitt was traveling when Nuss completed the room. And when he came back, he hated the colors. Of course, he went to Robert Henry and got him to work on the color scheme. Henry said he just couldn't do any better. He pacified Hewitt by saying, let the ladies put in curtains and pillows to harmonize it all. The fireplace in the corner has that curious beehive form that was developed in New Mexico. It's been dubbed Kiva fireplace. I don't know why. It's got nothing to do with the Indian kivas that are ceremonial spaces. You'll see elements of original furniture designed by Nussbaum and Chapman. They reflect what Nuss called his reconnaissance tour, as he went motorcycling around the whole region, photographing architectural details, woodwork, and furniture from mission churches. These antiques, which were fashioned in distinctive regional style, were the basis and the models for the furniture that they designed for the women's boardroom. You'll see the adaptation of the new old Santa Fe style all around you in town, as it's been carried out with greater or lesser degree of success by following generations. But it all started here at the New Mexico Museum of Art. But this museum is not frozen in time. In 1982, a modern wing was added for temporary exhibitions. I hope you'll spend time with the works of art here and come back again and again, as I do, to revisit favorites from the permanent collection that look so at home in this environment. But I also come back to check out what's new.